Welcome to this November 2023 case study class. My name's Kieran Doe. I'm a senior tutor at ACA Masters. When I sat the case study exam myself, I won the ICAW prize for the highest score in the world. I have also coached several students to win prizes from ICAW for their performance in the case study exam. During this class, I'll be teaching you the optimal exam technique to use for requirement 1. This class is taken from the ACA Masters case study video course. Full details for the course can be found on the ACA Masters website, acamasters.com/case study, and then full details are in the video course section. During the class, I'll be working through the ACA Masters Mock Exam 1. And to answer the question, I'll be referring to our AI analysis document, which analyzes and summarizes each exhibit from the advanced information, picking out the key points and collating them together. In order to guide the exam technique that I'll be using our November 2023 pro forma report, which reminds you of the sections to include for each requirement and the type of points to include in each section. And as I work through the mock exam, I'll be referring to my model answer. And this is an answer which is achievable to produce in the time, but also sufficient to ensure that you score a prize-winning mark. This will be scoring close to 100%. And of course, I will also be referring to the ICAW-styled marking key. And again, as with the video course, full details of our mock exams, model answers, and AI analysis and pro forma report can be found on the case study page of the ACA Masters website. So I'm going to work through each requirement one by one, and I'll explain how you should have interpreted the requirement and then use the exam paper information to structure your report. So I suggest that you look at the requirement first of all. So you could have a brief high-level look at the information here, but we will of course get an email from the partner and they'll high-level summarize the information that is included in the exhibits. So we've got the latest management accounts, which we will be reviewing, and then there are also some business issues facing FDM. So we've got a note to go with the management accounts, and that includes a request for advice. So we know we've got a request for advice in requirement 1. And then of course we've got the draft management accounts themselves. So that's for requirement 1. And then we can see here we've got the information for requirements 2 and 3. So please draft for my review a report addressed to the board. The report should comprise the following. So we've got a review of FDM's performance for the year ended 30th of September 23 in comparison with the previous year, as we would expect. It should cover revenue for each client size and in total, gross profit for each client size and in total, and operating profit. So it's very important to focus on exactly what we are being asked. So revenue, gross profit and operating profit. And then for revenue and gross profit, as we would even if it just asked us to do those in totals, we will of course look at that broken down by the client size categories. So using management accounts set out in the exhibit, incorporating as appropriate the additional information and FDM's KPIs. So we know that we'll get obviously the management accounts with the narrative to go with it. And they've also told us to include KPIs in there as well. So they may already be calculated for us. We may need to calculate them ourselves. And then, of course, as we've already gathered, there's a request for advice as well. So that additional piece of analysis that quite often we get in requirement 1. So based on your analysis, conclude on the performance. Well, we'd always do that anyway, and make appropriate recommendations. And we would always do that anyway, regardless of whether that sentence is in there or not. So as I said, very important to focus on exactly what we have been asked for. And that will kind of help you picture what the marking key will look like. And therefore that will allow you to kind of estimate how much you need to write for each section. So if you think what our requirement 1 is going to look like, if we think to our pro forma report, then of course we're going to have a section for revenue, and we'll have 5 to 6 points here. We'll have a section for gross profit, and then we will also have a section for operating profit, and then we've got an additional piece of analysis here. So the request for advice doesn't appear to have ethics in the question. We haven't been asked for that. And then, of course, we'll have our conclusions and recommendations. So we know what our headings are going to be for our requirement 1. And then if we think about the marking key, so we can think about how much we're going to need to write for each section. Of course, we know the boxes on the far left and the far right won't change. So these will be the same, regardless of what the requirement is asking for. We know we're going to have, these boxes here on the left-hand side, and then conclusions and recommendations here. So there's really these 6 in the middle, which are up for grabs. We need to think about how are we going to estimate, what these boxes are. Now, of course, in every case study exam, revenue has been the top 2 boxes. On one occasion, it was actually 4 boxes where there was quite a lot of analysis that could be done. But in every other case study, it's been 2, and we need to do revenue here, and revenue's always been required in requirement 1. So it's pretty safe that these 2 will be revenue. So really, it's only these 4 we need to think about. Now, if there's a request for advice, then you should assume that will take up 2 boxes here. So what this means is that gross profit and operating profit will be in the same box. They'll share a box. And that's quite useful to think, because then that will kind of help you decide how much to include. Because the real danger with requirement 1, I don't think people struggle with coming up with ideas or know what to include in requirement 1. It's almost like holding yourself back and not writing too much so that you overrun, and therefore you don't have enough time for requirements 2 and requirement 3. So we know that we're going to have about 5 mini paragraphs for revenue. But then when we think about profit, we're going to have to try to keep this down really. We're probably not going to have time to do all of this. We're probably not going to have time to go through every single cost line, then do overall gross profit for every client size, look at gross profit mix, then do admin and selling, some further analysis on the support staff if we can, and then operating profit. That's probably going to be too much, and you can kind of see there we've kind of got like 10, 11 mini paragraphs. But if these are sharing a box, we only really want 6, maybe 7 as an absolute maximum, and that will be determined by how much time you have after doing revenue. So perhaps if there wasn't a request for advice and therefore you thought gross profit would be 2 and operating profit would be 2, then yes, you could have more there. But again, it's probably unlikely that operating profit will have its own box, because in FDM there isn't as much analysis that we can do on operating profit. So it's really useful to kind of do that at the start of the question, look carefully at what the requirement is asking you for, and then once you've read that, just try to visualize what the marking key looks like, and that will kind of help you estimate. It's never going to be exact, we can't completely read the examiner's mind, but it'll help you estimate what the marking key is likely to look like, and therefore you'll know how much to write for each section. But of course, the areas we focus on, whether we focus on having a point on billable staff or other, that is also going to be determined by the information that we're provided in the exhibits. Because of course, we know with requirement 1, we're going to have some narrative here, which will give us some reasons why things have gone up or down, the narrative information from the FD. And then, of course, we've got the accounts themselves as well. So if you do have to decide to focus on a particular point, or if you think that you've got 8 or 9 different areas you could write on here and you can't decide which one to focus on, we'll focus on the ones which have had the biggest movement in the number, have had the most significant change, and where there's a reason from the exam paper as to why they have gone up or down. And we'll see that as we go through. So as we know what we need to do for each section, we can then start looking at the information and analysing the numbers. So there are different ways you can go about this. Some people just like to get through the numbers and therefore they like to jump straight to their appendix and just go through and do all of the numbers. You may feel well rehearsed on this, having practiced several mock exams, you just want to get through and get all the numbers done. Personally, I like to have a quick read through the information, kind of high level, see what information we're told about. And then I actually like to do my appendix in sections. So I'll do all of the numbers for revenue, and then I'll actually write up my revenue section. And then I'll do the numbers for cost of sales and gross profit and write up my gross profit section, and then for operating profit and so on. But there is an element of personal preference there. It isn't necessarily, one way, my way's right and all other ways are wrong. If you prefer to do all of the numbers, that's absolutely fine. At the end of the day, we need to do all of the numbers and write up all of the analysis. The reason I quite like to do it like that is because I'll do the numbers for revenue. They're kind of fresh in my mind. I know what the big changes are and the story behind the numbers. And then I like to just kind of write it up while revenue's fresh in my mind. And then, I'll do the same for, cost of sales and gross profit. I'll go through, look at the numbers, look at the margins, and then I kind of, I'm focused on that. And then I like to just kind of type it up while it's still fresh in my mind. But like I say, other approaches are equally valid, and it's an element of personal preference in that. And before I get on with the numbers, I'd like to have a quick high-level look through here to see what additional information we're given. So we can see here that we've got the note, obviously, from the FD, and additional information relating to the 2023 accounts. So it's split between clients and staff. So 2 key areas, of course, for FDM. So to support staff development and career progression, we began to staff large and major clients with more junior members. Whilst this was not an issue for most clients, some were not happy with the change in personnel and moved their digital marketing work to another agency. So that sounds as though they've lost some large and major clients. That will obviously impact churn, but that might be a reason why perhaps large and major won't meet the revenue target. So that's obviously going to be a reason there that I'm going to be including in my section for major and large. So what you might want to do at this point on the pro forma report, you might want to just kind of note that down where we've got here, because of course we know for each section we're going to say number up or down, and then give a reason, and that's obviously a reason from the exam paper. So you might just want to kind of scribble that on as you go through. Of course, that could have an impact on the profit margin as well, because if they're using more junior members, remember that's one of the reasons why small and medium have a higher gross profit margin, because they're staffed with junior employees, whereas large and major use more highly experienced staff. So you could even note that on further down in your gross profit section as well. We know that we're going to need to comment on gross profit overall and then by each client size. So we've got notable client wins in the year included. We're told a couple of client wins here So we're told about Super Save, grocery retailer nationwide, and FDM expects to generate annual revenue of 68K. So of course we know that that is a large client, slightly towards the top end of that typical distribution. But that would be a reason there why large has gone up. So you could go and note that down there in your revenue section. So of course that's going to be a reason why large has gone up. And then we've got AI Reach, management consultancy with global operations, and expects to generate annual revenue of this. So obviously that's a major client, and therefore we'd be including that in our major section. Again, above the typical average and towards the higher end of the range. So that's all to do with large and major. Then we're told small and media clients who are only using FDM for SEO work were encouraged to start using paid advertising to boost their website traffic and sales. So encouraged to start using paid advertising to increase take up. All paid search management work use performance-based pricing. So there are small and medium clients who are only using FDM for SEO work, which of course is like routine, regular, but typically lower margin. So they were encouraged to start using paid advertising, which of course we know is higher margin for FDM. So, paid search management, higher margin, growing area. So they were all encouraged to take that out. And that's going to be on a performance-based pricing basis. So we know that FDM will get paid, if the campaigns are successful. And we know that does result, it's higher risk, but it's also higher margin as well. So again, you might want to go to put some of those in your gross profit section as reasons. As FDM's proposed fees were calculated on additional revenue generated by the client, this was sold to clients on a no-win, no-fee proposal. And of course, we know that that's the basic principle of the performance-based pricing. So then we've got a reason as to why small and medium client revenue's gone up, because they've taken out paid advertising, and of course that would result in higher margins as well. So we could go and kind of note those on as revenue reasons, but also that will impact gross profit as well. So we've got some reasons there. Then we're told after running a highly successful paid advertising campaign for Compare, who we know from the AI is a medium-sized client because of the size of the typical average revenue. The same approach was applied to other clients of a similar size, but unfortunately the results were not as good. In some cases, no additional revenue was generated. So of course, if the client didn't generate any additional revenue from the campaign, then obviously FDM doesn't generate any revenue, assuming that it's based on attributable revenue to the campaign, but FDM will still have the costs, and therefore that would result in a lower profit margin there for medium. So we could go and note that down there as a reason. And it could, of course, also be a reason why medium revenue may be lower and may have missed the target. We're told about overall client churn was 8.9%, so that's definitely a reduction. This is broken down by client size below. So you'll probably be quite familiar with what these numbers are, but clearly that's lower. And of course, we've got them on the pro forma report as well. So it's a good point to kind of tag on the end of each section. But we can see that the client churn is lower overall, but major, that's definitely an increase, and an increase in the previous year as well. So it's definitely higher than it was in the previous year. And then we've got large as well, which is higher. And then medium and small both actually look lower because they're usually higher than the other two. And you can see that those churn rates are lower. So we can clearly see where we would use that. Just tag those on at the end of our revenue section for each paragraph. And then we're told about staff. So we're told headcount increased to 117. So actually that's higher than the target. And of course, we'll be commenting on that. And we're told how it's broken down between billable and support staff. we're told how many staff left during the year, and of those who left, 7 had joined in the year. So we could work out attrition based on the normal method, but also the revised method as well, because we know how many staff left and we know what headcount is at the start, but we actually know of those who left how many had joined in the year. So therefore we could work the revised amount out, and based on the total staff who left and the normal method based on staff who were already in the existing headcount. To support recruitment and reduce attrition, there was an increase in salaries for billable staff, and all staff were given the flexibility to work from home for up to 4 days per week. So an increase in salaries for billable staff, and then all staff were given the flexibility to work from home. So maybe that's had an impact on the attrition, because we know flexibility is a factor in employees leaving. But then we know as well that there's been an increase in salaries. That would be a reason there why billable staff costs may have gone up. And of course, we can do some analysis here, because you can work out the average salary per billable staff member. So you can see whether any changes were due to a headcount increase or like an average salary per billable staff. The board decided not to pay a staff bonus because the revenue target was not achieved. So we kind of told that the revenue target hasn't been achieved. And then we've got the request for advice. We'll come back to this separately. It makes sense to do the analysis of the performance for the year and then move on to the request for advice. So having a kind of a high level look through, we can see what the main events were in the year, and we've thought about where we're going to use those in our answer, and you may have noted them on, or even made a quick highlight on the exam paper, as I have done. So we know that roughly the main events in the year, but of course, when we get on to analysing the numbers, we can see what's gone up and what's gone down. But as we can see, the revenue target hasn't been met, just slightly short of the target. And then when we get on to the notes of the accounts, we can then see the breakdown by client size. So as I said, I like to do each section one at a time. So I'll do the revenue section. So obviously with the AI analysis document, it's nice and easy to just go through and put the prior year numbers in. And to be honest with you, by the time you get to the exam and you've done quite a few mock exams, you may even know some of these numbers off by heart. Probably worth double checking though, because you don't want to make a silly mistake, which would then cause you to lose a lot of easy marks for the numbers. But you can go through and put those in, and then you can do the mix. You could even calculate the formula for mix for the prior year. So do that major revenue divided by the total to get to the mix figure. And then drag it down just to make sure, because you can then kind of double check these to the numbers you've got here, and then you can make sure your formulas are in correctly, and then you can just drag it across to the current year and just double check and make sure everything's brought over correctly. Or you could just hard type in all of the prior year numbers. And then just get the current year numbers, of course, from the current year accounts. You can start putting those in and calculate the change and then bring that down. But then as I go through and I calculate the numbers, I like to kind of look and think about kind of what I'm seeing here, because, of course, as we've said, the overall revenue is lower than the target, the 35% target. And you can see that's the case as well for major and large. But not for medium and small. They both achieved the target, higher than 35%, but major and large didn't. And of course, with small and medium growing faster than major and large, then of course the revenue mix will shift towards medium and small, because the revenue from those two groups is increasing faster than the other two. So that's shifting there. And of course, we know that has an impact on profit margins. We know medium and small clients generally have higher profit margins. So that's going to be a reason there. And we'll look at that with our profit analysis. And of course, they're deviating away now from the 25% equal split between the different client groups. So headcount, as we've already said, they're above the target there. So the growth is more than 35%. And then we can work out the average monthly fee income per head, a KPI there. And of course, that's fallen. Revenue hasn't reached the target. Revenue's only gone up by 32.8, but headcount went up by more than that. And therefore, average monthly fee income per head has declined again. So we can start to see the story behind the numbers for this year. And then we can calculate the attrition rate. Because it's included in headcount is why I've done it here. It's just, if you've already got the headcount number here, you can do it here. Or you may decide that you want to put it in with your cost of sales. It's because it relates to staff. That's entirely up to you. But we know we were told here in the exam paper that, of course, 16 staff left in total, but 7 of those had joined in a year. And we know the normal way of calculating attrition is they use staff who left, but not those who joined in a year. So obviously, of the staff who left, there was only 9 who were included in the brought forward headcount. So it'd be like 9 divided by the brought forward headcount to give us a 10.6. But if you use a revised attrition rate, which Ron Ashton had suggested in his operational improvements document, then it's obviously be 18.8. And then the client churn figures, we were just given them. So you can put the prior year numbers in. And it is possible to kind of calculate like an approximate of the clients at the start, because of course we know the typical average. So therefore it's possible to do like an estimate of clients who were in the start. And therefore you could kind of work backwards. If you've got the churn rate and you've got the clients at the start, you can work backwards to get the clients who were lost during the year. Don't think we really needed to do it. It's a churn rate that we really want. But it's important to, I think, appreciate how that calculation works. So then they're the numbers for our revenue section. So like I said, we could then start typing our revenue section up. We know what the story is here with the numbers, having looked at those. We've already thought about what our reasons are for each section, for each different client size group. And we've thought about, how we're going to structure it. We're going to have overall revenue, then major, large, medium, small, and then something called mix. So that would kind of give us our 6 points, which I'd say is the maximum to have for revenue, obviously, because there's kind of like 6 bullets here and these points follow on from those. So 6 is probably ideal. If you do struggle, you could perhaps miss out mix, but I think aim for 6 would be good. Works out quite perfectly really with 4 different revenue streams. So we know what we're going to have. And of course, when we're doing the individual client sizes, very repetitive really in terms of our exam technique, we're going to say, has the number gone up or down? We'll briefly compare it to the target, and then we'll give a reason as to why. So number, whether it's met the target, reason, and then try to include an additional point as well, maybe comment on the trend, or is there any further analysis that we could do? So are we told about any new clients? Can we compare that to the typical distribution? Or maybe have something about churn in there as well if we're given those numbers. But then we'll do the same thing for each one. So we'll move on to large. Has it gone up or down? With the number, has it met the target? Reason, trying to get the reason from the exam paper, trying to use this exam paper information as much as possible in our answer. And then again, is there a further analysis point we could have? And then we'll comment on churn, and then we'll do the same thing. So that's quite repetitive, that section. Then we'll comment on mix and say whether it's in line with the 25% target. So overall revenue, we're not going to go into the detailed reasons why each individual client size has gone up or down, because we're going to do that here. So overall, we kind of have some kind of overall high level points, but we're going to look at overall revenue. We're going to obviously say how much it's gone up or down by, compare it to the target, and also to the market growth. So that would be the first thing to do. So we've got overall revenue. Obviously, 32.8% is below the 35% growth. I would say what it's gone up to as well. You don't always need to add the 2023 number, but I think it's good to have it. I like to have it for my overall numbers. I think it probably would be there in a analyst report. That's obviously below the target, as we've said, but it is above the market compound annual growth rate of 10%, or around 10%, as we were told in the AI. So that'll be the first point to have in there. But then the other kind of high level points, a good point to always try to do is, can you analyze the revenue between like price and volume? So, in the case of this business, in the case of FDM, that's looking at, the number of headcount, the number of staff they have, and how much revenue they're getting per staff member, how much revenue is being generated per staff member, multiplied by the headcount, the number of staff, the volume equals total revenue. So you can analyze total revenue by looking at, has any increase or decrease, but most likely an increase, has that come from the amount of revenue being generated per employee, or is it because of a headcount change, or is it because of both? So what we can do is say what the average monthly fee income per head now is, compare it to the target, and then look at headcount, see what the change in that is, compare it to the target, and then that will show whether the growth is due to an increase in average monthly fee income per head, or an increase in headcount, or both. So then we can do that there for the next part. Average monthly fee income is obviously decreased, so it's obviously below the target and it's below the previous peak. Headcount is actually higher than the target, and that's probably because attrition had reduced. They didn't lose as many staff as they thought they would, which shows that the revenue target not being achieved is due to the average monthly fee income per head. They had the target, it relied upon average monthly fee income, staying the same, and headcount going up by 35%, but average monthly fee income per head has decreased. So that's the reason why. Think about it. Headcount met the target, so headcount did its part of achieving the target, but average monthly fee income per head had declined, and that's why they didn't meet the target. And then, as we told in the AI, like staff capacity is an enabler of revenue growth. So therefore, we could comment on whether that leaves them well positioned for future growth. And it's also important to mention about the economy, and also try to mention a point about COVID in requirement 1 as well. That will usually get a mark. Probably talk about more how that's had a historic impact, but a fragile economy may have had a negative impact. And then compare the growth rate as well to the previous year. We can comment on whether revenue from all client sizes has gone up or possibly gone down, but I think that's kind of quite unlikely in a fast-growing business like this. But when we mention COVID, we could perhaps mention it in the context of that has accelerated the trend towards digital business models. That would be a good place to mention that. And then we can mention churn overall as well. So a fragile economy may have had a negative impact. So the fact that the rate of growth is increasing is excellent. So that's a good point to mention there. Revenue from all clients, of course, in this case had gone up. And obviously COVID has had an impact in terms of shifting businesses towards digital model, which has increased demand for digital marketing. And then we've got the churn rate in there as well. So what we're trying to do here is, of course, we'll get a mark for overall. We get that because it's in the appendix, but overall revenue. And then you can see here, we've made quite a few of these points. So faster growth than the previous year, it's below the target, but it's above the industry compound annual growth rate, which is a bit frustrating. Of course, these points are backslashed because we're only getting one mark here. But sometimes that's just the way it goes. In case study, it could be, that a couple of these points on a separate point, and therefore we'd get 2 marks for that. We of course mentioned the average monthly fee income per head, and we say that growth was due to headcount, we mentioned that point, and average monthly fee income per head is below the target, headcount's above the target. So we've definitely got those points. Again, like I said, a bit frustrating when you get several points which are backslash because you're only getting one mark, but that's just the way it goes. Just as when you make a good valid point and it just doesn't end up on the marking key, that's part of the frustration with case study. But we can see here we've kind of done well there, picking up several points there in this section with our overall revenue. And then, like I said, we can go down and we can go through each client size one by one. So here we've got major revenue. And then, as I said here, we're going to say, number, with the reason. We can have some kind of further analysis on that number, the churn rate. We'll do that for each one. And we'd already picked up the reasons, from the exam paper. That's trying to use this information as much as possible in our answer. So we can see here major revenue increased substantially. So there's the number, said it's below the target. Then we've got the reason. So we said there were some client losses as some clients weren't happy with more junior staff on the team. We picked that up from the exam paper. But of course, if they lost some clients, they must have won more than they lost. And the same thing had happened, I think, in a previous year where they said new client wins had offset any losses. And like I said, you could kind of do a high level on this. If you did the major revenue divided by the average typical client size, you'd see that there would be more clients than there were at the end of the previous year. So we've got our easy reason from the exam paper. And then, of course, the exam paper told us about this new client, AI Reach. And then we've said that's expected to be higher than the typical average. So it's just kind of a useful thing to compare that to in the context of something. And then churn had increased quite significantly. And that was because they weren't happy with the staff changes. And a good kind of context point here is we know that churn can be erratic for major clients because multinational companies have low switching costs. And there's also just simple maths. There's a small number of clients in this category. There's only, I think, like 14, 12 the previous year, 14 at the end of 22 in this client category. So obviously if they lose one or two clients, then that's going to have a marked impact on the percentage. Whereas when it's obviously with smaller clients, then that wouldn't have quite so much of an impact because there's a lot more clients in that category. So what we're trying to do here is obviously get the mark for the number. That's nice and easy. You should be getting that. And that's why I said it's important to get those numbers correct because these are quite easy marks. And then you can see here, they've got the reason here. So higher churn with the figure, or could have said that the new client's bigger than the average or the junior staff. So we've kind of picked those points up there. And then we'll go through and do the same. So it was quite similar with large. So large had gone up. So it's gone up, but it's also below the target. So we know that major was below the target. Large is also below the target. Now, it is because of the same reasons, because they said they put junior staff on major and large. So it'd be fine to just say that there. But then we were told about a specific client, and we can compare that to the average. Obviously, that is higher than the typical average in that category. And then the churn rate had changed as well. And then coming through, so again, just doing the same thing. So large, we get the number there. The reason had been kind of backslashed with major, but of course that was quite similar. So then we've got medium. So medium increased, with the number. That's actually above the target, and you can see that in the growth figure as well. So you could say above the target, 35% growth, but if you want to be even a little bit quicker. Due to, and we knew, of course, it was more paid advertising management work and a highly successful campaign for Compare. Then we've got churn as well. And again, that's gone down. And the reason that may have gone down, of course, is we know that performance-based pricing reduces churn. But you do done the same thing here. So medium, and then we've got the reason, like performance-based fees, lower churn. You can see we've made quite a few of those points. And then small, above the target, also above the target. And again, that's the same thing, they pushed paid advertising management work, churn's gone down. And we know actually a bit more specifically that churn is estimated at 5% when clients are on performance-based pricing. So we know that's typically 5% for small clients on performance-based pricing. So that'd be a good point to bring in here. So you'd expect that to, if more clients are on that performance-based pricing, then you'd expect that churn would move down closer to that 5%. That's quite a significant decline there in the churn there for small clients. So it's a really good year, really, for small clients, because that's all actually the revenue growth wasn't as high as medium, but it exceeded the target. And of course, the churn had declined significantly. So again, let me pick up the number for small. You can see here, this point here, if we'd said that small or medium were above the target, we'd get the mark. Or we also said that one as well, but we only needed one of them. And it's good to comment on mix as well. So just to say how the revenue mix has shifted. So of course, as we've said, because small and medium had grown the most, then obviously revenue mix would be moving towards them. So that's just a quick sense check of your answer to make sure your answer looks sensible. But we can see it's moving even more towards small. So that's definitely deviated now from the 25% target. And kind of a context point here, we know that a range of clients helps staff retention, because it gives them the opportunity, particularly with the small ones, but then they can progress up to the larger ones as well. And then you can see here that we pick up the marks and mix. I mean, you didn't actually need all of them. They're quite generous there, the backslashing. And then obviously the mix is deviated from the target. So you can see there how we would pick up the marks for revenue. So I think with looking at the individual client sizes, so major, large, medium, and small, you can kind of see how we're using the same technique, a number, reason, further analysis point if we can, and then either bringing in a context point or looking specifically at churn. And then overall revenue is a bit different because you're not going into the specific reasons. Obviously, you're doing that for each of the individual client types. But here we're looking at kind of like the overall analysis of overall revenue. Is it above the target? How does it compare to the market? And then looking at that analysis, is it due to average monthly fee income per head, or is it due to head count? And of course, compare the growth to the previous year, make a point about COVID, as we always would, as we've seen in the past exams. So the key there is to get revenue done comprehensively, thoroughly, as I've demonstrated there, but also doing it in time to make sure that you move on and you've got enough time to get these other points. So we can then move on and calculate our numbers for cost of sales and gross profit. We've only got a couple of cost of sales lines, with obviously billable staff being the largest and most significant, but then we've got gross profit as well by client size. So you can go through and calculate the numbers here, drop the numbers in for the two cost of sales lines. Again, obviously got the prior year in the AI analysis document. And you can look at the cost as a percentage of revenue. You could also look at like the mix, between the two. And then of course, if you look at it as a percentage of revenue, then the difference between, revenue 100% minus this would obviously give us our overall gross profit margin. So you can see that actually profit margin will be improved because that's taking up a lower share of revenue. That's total cost of sales. And you can look at the mix between the two. So of course we can see here that billable staff have gone up quite significantly, and that is faster than revenue, but other costs haven't. They look to have been very well controlled, and they've reduced as a percentage of revenue, whereas billable staff is slightly higher. And then we can see here with the average billable staff cost, which we can calculate by looking at billable staff divided by billable headcount. We can see that has increased, and we were told about that pay rise. So I would definitely be including a paragraph on billable staff, because we've got lots of good information here from the exam paper. We've got a reason for the exam paper because there was the pay increase. There's been quite a significant change in this number as well. It's now accounting for quite a lot more of cost of sales. So therefore, that is quite a significant change. So I'm definitely including something on billable staff because there's a reason from the exam paper. There's been a significant change, and I can do some quite interesting analysis as well by looking at average billable staff costs, which obviously has increased, and obviously headcount drives the cost as well. And of course, we want the KPI in there as well on attrition, so that slots in quite nicely there with billable staff. I guess it could go with support staff because it is for all staff, but it fits in kind of quite nicely here when we're talking about staff. Obviously, compare that to the average. So definitely be including that. Other costs, if I've got time, I'll include a section on that. But obviously, I need to do gross profit, and we need to do it by each client size group. So then we can pick up the gross profit numbers here for the current year, and then we've got the prior year. We can calculate the change in gross profit, but what's really interesting to look at and the area to focus on is looking at the gross profit margin. So we can see that the gross profit margin has gone up for major, it's gone up for large, it's gone down quite significantly for medium, but of course we knew there were some unsuccessful campaigns there on performance-based pricing. So FDM has obviously hasn't earned any revenue, but it's incurred the cost of running those campaigns, so that would be why that's gone down. And then small has gone up quite significantly, and we weren't told that the additional campaigns there were unsuccessful. So of course we know that small clients are now doing more paid search management work, which is higher margin, and of course performance paid pricing, which is higher margin. So that would be the reason there. Could do a quick calculation of gross profit mix, but of course, as I've explained before, if more revenue is now in the small category and the margins have improved, then of course gross profit mix will be moving towards small. So you might decide to do your operating profit at the same time. I mean, there's only a couple of numbers here, unless they give you the average payroll costs, so that you can work out, do that further analysis, and then work out what the average support cost is. If you don't get the average payroll cost, so if you're not told this number in the exam paper like we were in the AI, then you're not going to be able to do this analysis. So then we'll simply be looking at admin and selling costs and as a percentage of revenue, and then gross profit. So there wouldn't be as much to do here. So you may decide to do those numbers at the same time, but that's obviously declined as a percentage of revenue, so that would also help feed into a higher operating profit margin, but obviously still below the target there. So we've thought about we need to be quite controlled here. We don't want to get carried away, because there's a lot you could write here about cost of sales and gross profit. We haven't really got time to do all of it, and we know that they're sharing a box. We're kind of looking for 6 mini paragraphs really. So we want to comment on billable staff because there's a lot to be said there. We'll do overall gross profit, of course. We'll do the 4 individual client size groups. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's already 6, and we definitely need to do operating profit because the question asked for it. We'll do operating profit. Maybe you wouldn't say as much on admin and selling. There wasn't any further analysis that could really be done here. Although I do like to have an overall cost of sales point, because there's usually a mark here for comparing whether all costs have increased faster or slower than revenue. But you can kind of see how you do have to try and be strict with your time, because if you do everything, you might run out of time. Obviously, if you can get a little bit more done within the time, then that's fine to do. But you don't want to overrun on requirement 1. Because there's plenty of easy marks in requirement 2 and 3. And the key to passing is making sure that you get all the easy and medium marks across the paper, which are scattered across all of the requirements. So then in our analysis here, like I said, we could start off with an overall point about cost of sales, probably be quite brief here and just say what it's gone up to So we've got the numbers there, but then say, is it due to an increase in all costs? But the important bit is, did it increase faster or slower than revenue? And if it increased slower than revenue, then it will have a positive impact on the gross profit margin. And that usually picks up a mark. We'd get this for being in our appendix, but there's usually a mark here for comparing the change in cost of sales with the change in revenue. And then I said, the main cost of sales line I would comment on would be billable staff, because that had gone up quite significantly. We had a reason from the exam paper. Remember, the exam paper had told us that there was an increase in salaries. And of course, there's been an increase in headcount as well. So it's kind of a combination of both. So due to the salary increases, so reason from the exam paper, and we can now see what percentage it is of revenue. Then we've got like the average billable staff cost, which we've seen increase. So we could calculate that ourselves, which was another reason why I wanted to look at average billable staff, why I wanted to look at billable staff, because we had that interesting metric there to look at. And that kind of shows us that this increase in billable staff is due to a salary increase and a headcount increase. It's due to like a combination of both. There's more staff and you're paying each staff member more. So kind of when we looked at overall revenue, you can kind of break the total figure down by looking at, is it due to a change in volume, i.e. number of staff, i.e. headcount, or is it due to like the change in like price per unit, if you like, average income being generated per staff member, or here, average salary cost per staff member. And then we can comment on the attrition. You could do it on the normal basis or the revised basis, as we've discussed, but definitely compare that to the sector average. And then we've got a context point here as well, that there's upward pressure on wages. So there is quite a lot of interesting analysis that can be done on billable staff. So I think that is quite an interesting cost line to look at there. But we're doing the same thing. So you can see here, billable staff, that's the number. And then we've got the average cost with the figure. So you might not have had time to look at other, and that would be fine. If you didn't, I briefly made a quick point there because I thought with that increased headcount, there'd obviously be the higher recruitment fees as well. But I think I kind of came back and did that. I did the moved on to the gross profit here because this is the important part to look at. So again, kind of similar to revenue. When you go through gross profit, you can do it by each client size, and then you're going to get the specific reason for each one there. But when you do your overall gross profit, you'll be looking at it, overall, making some kind of high level comments overall, not the specific reason for each one. So, for example, when we looked at small, for example, we'd say that yes, gross profit's gone up. Now, what's important is you focus on the gross profit margin, say whether that's gone up or down, and then trying to get the reason from the exam paper. So small, sort of strongest growth. This is how much the profit margin, the overall gross profit had gone up by. But focusing on that margin, quite a significant increase in the margin. And why was that? Why has the profit margin gone up? Because like we said, they've been doing more higher margin paid search management work and more work based on performance fee billing. Both of those are higher margin. So, and we were told that in the AI that performance fee based work is higher risk, but it does result in a higher margin. And paid search management work is higher margin than SEO. And then like with medium, that's all the weakest growth. So you can say it's gone up impressively or significantly, but you can also compare them as well, which is good to say which one is the strongest, the best, and which one is the weakest. So the weakest growth, disappointing gross profit margin decrease, and that was because of the unsuccessful performance-based pricing campaigns. I guess that kind of shows what I mean here about the risk. Is obviously the risk is that they do these campaigns, but they're only going to be paid if it's successful, and we were told that some were unsuccessful in the exam paper for medium clients. So therefore, FDM isn't earning any revenue, but it's obviously incurred the cost of running those campaigns. And then with major, so it saw a gross profit increase, and we knew that was because they were staffing clients with junior staff, and junior staff have a lower cost. Like we said, we told that in the AI. It's the reason why small in particular has higher margin, because they use junior employees there. It's not the only reason, because the clients are less demanding as well, but that'd be a reason that we could use there. So you can kind of see when you're doing it by each client size, you're trying to look really for a specific reason for that client size. But then when we look at overall gross profit, we'll probably have some overall points that kind of affected a few different areas. But again, you can have that the absolute increase, and then whenever I'm looking at an overall number, as I said, I like to have the absolute 2023 figure there. The gross profit margin, the important thing to look at, has increased. There's several reasons here, and we kind of brought those together on the pro forma report, where we were saying that there's a lot of areas, a lot of elements which affect the profit margin. So it could be whether the profit margin has increased for all of the client sizes, which it hadn't here because medium had obviously gone down. But with revenue mix, particularly focusing on that, as it moved towards a higher margin small and medium clients, which it has here. It has moved towards those higher margin small and medium clients. Has it moved towards paid search management work, which is higher margin, or conversely, has it moved towards lower margin major and large clients, or lower margin SEO and content creation work? Is more or less work based on performance fee billing. So we know all of these at the billing basis, the type of work, and the client all affect the margin. So you have to consider which way each of those have gone. And of course, has an average monthly fee income per head increase, because that would cause the margin to be higher. So we saw quite a few of these factors in this exam paper, because we saw the revenue mix shift towards the higher margin small and medium clients. We saw the revenue mix shift towards that higher margin paid search management work, and we saw more work based on performance fee billing. And actually the margin went up despite the average monthly fee income per head decreasing. So again, you can kind of see what we're doing here. So we've said, we've gone through it when we look at overall gross profit and then the margin. Again, unfortunately, the gross profit margin points about client mix has ended up being backslash of a point we've already made. And that's another danger, really, of having too much in your answer. It might be that you've got kind of lots of good correct points, but of course, there's always a risk that your points get backslashed. But then you can see by going through each of them one by one, we did this, major, and then there was a point here about lower junior staff costs. We obviously got large as well, medium, just getting the numbers right, and then unsuccessful campaign, the performance-based fees, small, higher margin, and then again, more paid search management work. So you can kind of see by really being really thorough, going through each of them as a requirement asked us to, each client size, number, reason, further insight point, picking up these points as we go through. And then in operating profit, admin and selling had gone up. We said it had gone up slower than revenue, and that had a positive impact on the profit margin. So similar with kind of cost of sales, total cost of sales, looking at the total admin expenses and comparing that growth to the change in revenue. And then we've got operating profit in the same way. We've got the absolute numbers, but then comparing what the operating profit margin now is to the target, what it was in the prior year, what the target is. And then if we could get a reason there, but we said it's gone up because the revenue mix has shifted away from demanding major and large clients who increase overheads. But you can see we've done that in the same way as we have with gross profit. And then you can see that just kind of finishes us up here and picks up those points there. And of course, we've got these as well. And then we've also, these points are just from in the appendix as we've analysed some of the staff KPIs like headcount increase and attrition. We've analysed client churn. We've done an analysis of costs. And then these are the context points. We mentioned COVID. I should have mentioned that when we did overall revenue. We mentioned COVID. We mentioned fragile economy, and we mentioned all of these points. Then there's the industry average. We've done attrition when we did staff, and we did headcount when we looked at overall revenue. So you can see we've done really well on requirement 1 already. And the conclusions and recommendations are relatively straightforward. So yes, we've got the request for advice to do, but you can see that it isn't the be-all or end-all on requirement 1. And you can see we've done really, really well on requirement 1 by doing the financial statement analysis part of the question, by using this kind of exam technique of number, reason, further insight point, and then trying to get context points in as we go, being thorough with the numbers and using the exam paper information as much as possible. So then we can go into the request for advice in a really strong position. In addition to the financial statement analysis, looking at the performance for the year, we were also asked to respond to the request for advice in Exhibit 16. So you can see here that on the first page, we were given all of the information as to why things had gone up or down in the year. And then we were specifically given this request for advice. And you can actually see kind of at the bottom here, we were actually told what we needed to do. So please advise us on the impact these proposals would have on operating profit, any other related issues the board should be aware of, and any actions that should be taken before a final decision is made. So you could focus your answer on this, the impact the proposals would have on operating profit, any other related issues, and any actions that should be taken before a final decision is made. So there's really recommendations, what that's saying there with the actions, and you should always have some recommendations. You can include your recommendations on the specific one-off piece of analysis or request for advice with all of your other recommendations below. But personally, I find it easier to just kind of put them in as I go. So I would typically have the request for advice and then have some recommendations here, and then have my one-off issue recommendations here, my non-request for advice recommendations here, my normal commercial recommendations. So our answer should focus on the impact the proposal should have on operating profit and any other related issues the board should be aware of. So we're told here, following recent discussions, and this is of course the managing director has asked me, so this is the finance director, to identify ways to improve the attractiveness of FDM to a prospective purchaser. I will be putting forward the proposals at the next board meeting. So, ways to improve the attractiveness of FDM to a prospective purchaser. So, proposal 1, allow permanent remote working. By allowing staff to permanently work from a remote location, our need for office space will greatly reduce. Our current short-term lease is due to expire soon, so we will be able to rent a considerably smaller space at a much reduced cost. So allow staff to permanently work from a remote location, reduce office space, and therefore reduce the cost. So that's the first proposal, and you may even decide, we've got 5 proposals here, you may decide that you want to just do them kind of one at a time. So obviously if they reduce the office cost, the rent, then that would of course improve operating profit. Now we're not told specifically in the AI where the lease rentals for the office are included, but there's no lease liability on the SFP, so presumably the lease rents are just being recorded through the P&L. Of course, these are management accounts as well. They're not the statutory IFRS financial statement. So, you don't need to be going into the technicalities of IFRS 16, although it does actually say that these are short-term leases where the lease rentals would be recorded through the P&L if it's less than 12 months, of course. But we don't need to go into all of that. So presumably they are recorded through the P&L. And even if it was a lease liability, you'd still have the interest expense and the depreciation and the right of use asset going through the P&L. So we can safely assume that the reduced rent would help increase operating profit because, of course, it would reduce expenses. And then if you think of any other related issues they should be aware of and then any actions to be taken, well, of course, a saving will depend on how much office space is required, which, of course, is determined by how many employees will actually come into the office. So that would be an additional point there. And then we could think of some recommendations, maybe survey staff to identify exactly how much space will be needed, research alternative office costs would be another good recommendation there. So you just short and concise it. So short, concise, try to get through all of the different issues. You don't need lots and lots of detail. The technique here is kind of quite similar to how we do our strategic and operational points in requirement 2 and requirement 3, as we will see when we come on to those. Proposal 2, reduce support staff. So it's billable staff who generate revenue. So reducing the number of support staff will cut costs and increase profit. Instead of relying on support staff, billable staff will be asked to do some of the admin work required for their clients. So, of course, that is true that, of course, that billable staff do drive revenue because it's them that provide the services to the clients. But we know, of course, from the AI that support staff facilitate the billable work, and therefore probably cutting support staff it isn't going to necessarily increase profit because then billable staff are going to have to do the support work and therefore presumably they'll be doing less billable work. And of course, we know that support staff earn slightly less than billable staff. So therefore that could potentially increase costs because now you've got billable staff who earn more than the support staff doing the support work. So that's probably inefficient, unless, of course, there's some sort of suggestion that billable staff will just be working more hours. So reducing support staff will increase the workload of billable staff, and this will either result in them working longer hours or doing less billable work, which would, of course, reduce profit. Support staff are paid less, so getting billable staff to do support work isn't efficient. And then a recommendation, maybe forecast workloads to see if there are any efficiencies that can be made, if support staff could be reduced slightly, possibly. We need to look into that. Proposal 3 is a discount for advance payment. So clients would be offered a 15% fee discount if they pay in advance of work being performed. So of course, we know if clients were to pay in advance of the service being provided, then that would be deferred income. So that wouldn't increase operating profit. In fact, it would reduce it because when that revenue is then recognized, it's now lower because they've been given a discount. So that wouldn't help increase operating profit. Payments in advance of deferred income, that won't increase operating profit. And like we said, it would actually end up reducing it when that revenue is recognized because they've been given a discount. FDM has sufficient cash, so there's no need. That would be more to kind of support cash rather than operating profit, but we can see that they've got sufficient cash, so there's no need for that proposal. And any suggestion that advance payment would be recorded as revenue would be incorrect. That should be deferred income in the financial statements. So even though these are management accounts, they don't have to be fully compliant with IFRS, they still need to follow basic, accounting principles such as accruals accounting. It wouldn't be a valid suggestion really to suggest getting payments in advance and just recording them as revenue, if that is the suggestion that's perhaps being implied there. Proposal 4, reduce capital expenditure. So capital expenditure will be capped at 160,000 per year. savings will primarily come from reduced expenditure on IT equipment, as we will ask staff to use their own equipment for work. So, of course, if capital expenditure is reduced, that would increase operating profit because it would reduce the depreciation expense, but it would take time for that to come through. Obviously, the assets capitalized, go straight on the SFP, and then it would be depreciated. But if they spend less on capital expenditure, then of course there's less to write off to the P&L over those years. But that would take some time for that benefit to come through. And also the suggestion of telling staff to use their own equipment might not be practically, operationally or for IT security, and it might just not be acceptable to staff. They might ask for a pay rise to compensate for that. So reduced capex will result in lower future depreciation, so that would increase operating profit. Answering the question, what's the impact on operating profit? Better benefit will take time to come through, and it may be unacceptable to staff as well. So it may be discussed with staff to see if it is feasible to do that. And then finally, proposal 5, introduce a staff bonus based on individual average monthly fee income per head. This will ensure that the overall average monthly fee income per head target is achieved, so will enable revenue and profit targets to be met. So increasing average monthly fee income per head would increase the profit, so that's going to be kind of higher revenue per employee. The cost per employee presumably staying the same, although there would be the bonus that would be paid, so that would increase cost slightly, but that would help increase operating profit. So that bonus should motivate staff. And a higher average monthly fee income per head would increase operating profit because, as I said, more revenue per employee, and the same number of employees would therefore result in higher profit. But the bonus itself would be an expense. So maybe you could calculate the target, for the bonus. So we're certainly going to have kind of about 12 points in here across the 2 boxes, but it's a bit unusual, a bit difficult to predict exactly what it would be. This is a little bit more unpredictable, the request for advice. There's so many different things that it could be, and we'll see some more of these in the mock exams, but it could be a specific staff issue, a specific issue of a client. It could be something to do with kind of pumping up the accounts, as we've seen here, would be obvious candidates. But it's endless, the amount of scenarios there could be for this. So just make sure that you focus, on the requirement. Quite often at the end, there'll be like a little sub requirement here, just kind of telling you exactly where to focus. So make sure you focus on that. Make sure you have some recommendations. Maybe think about the source of the information. Could there be any bias? But particularly like the impact on the accounts, and we had to do that there. The impact on the business, the significance of each issue, and if there are any numbers to calculate, then obviously make sure you calculate those as well. It could be that you have ethics in requirement 1 as well, rather than that one-off piece of analysis. So rather than it being something like this, it could be more of an ethics-based issue. But it is probably the harder part on requirement 1. And as I demonstrated, you could easily have got to a really high scoring mark on requirement 1 without doing particularly well here. Now, I'm not suggesting that you kind of leave this in any way or don't attempt it or don't give it sufficient time. You definitely should. But what I'm saying here is just don't become excessively worried if you're finding it difficult, or don't think somehow that, whether you pass or fail the requirement or the paper as a whole is going to depend on this. There's definitely a few easy marks there that you should be able to get. You could go for quite a systematic approach of working through the information, making sure you answer the requirement, and you will do well you will pick up like a few marks here. And it is important that you get a few points down so that you have something to include in your conclusions and in your executive summary. But whether you pass the paper overall really isn't going to hinge too much on these 2 boxes. And it's really important that you don't overrun excessively on this part of the paper and on this part of the requirement, because that will be to the detriment of requirements 2 and requirements 3. So then we can come on to our conclusions. And all we need to do here is to have a key point from each element that we were asked to report on. So we were asked to review the performance. And of course, we've got revenue, gross profit and operating profit, but specifically revenue and gross profit by each client size. So therefore, it's very important that we have a point in our conclusion on each of these. So we're going to have a point. So for revenue, we're going to have a point on each individual client size and in total, gross profit, each individual client size and in total, and then operating profit, and then also the request for advice. So of course, that's what we've done in the main body of our report. So of course, in our conclusions, we're not going to obviously have everything again. We just want the main point from each. So with overall revenue, we're not going to have all of this in our conclusions. We're just going to have the main headline point. And that is that overall revenue has increased, but it was below the target. So the main point for that section. So for overall revenue, the main point is that it's gone up by this amount, and that's below the target. So we'd copy that down into our conclusions. And then for major, what's the main point for each of the individual client sizes? Well, it's what the revenue has gone up or down by. So we take each of these points and maybe have the brief reason in there, or maybe say whether it's above or below the target, and just maybe the brief reason as to why it's gone up. But you certainly don't need all of the further analysis points. You don't need the churn point necessarily. You don't need the context point. You don't want to copy all of this, just the main point for each section. So you can kind of think of it as more like breadth rather than depth. So overall revenue, major, large, medium, and small, because that's what the requirement asks for. And you can see that's what we've got here. We can see overall revenue with the number and whether it met the target, major, below the target and a brief reason why, large, the number and a brief reason why, and then the same as well with medium and small. And then the same with gross profit as well. So you can just take, overall, we've got lots of reasons here why gross profit went up or down, and then we've commented on the trend as well. But all you need in your conclusions is, of course, the number and just maybe the first reason. So that's what we've taken there in the conclusion. So overall profit up, margins up by this, and then just picked up one of those reasons, the main one, that revenue mix had moved towards small and medium clients. And then again, we've got it by each individual client size because that's what the requirement asks for. So therefore, we should have that in our conclusions. But just briefly, the change and the brief reason why. And then operating profit, again, you can see, the number, the margin, and a quick comment on whether that met the target, and then the request for advice. So it just took two of the main points, really. The rent expense would help improve operating profit, and so would the staff bonus. They were the two of those suggestions. They seem to be the two which would actually help operating profit in the short term. So conclude on every section, and then we have the recommendations. So here we're just thinking of sensible action points based on what has happened in the year. So the pro forma report has got some useful kind of suggestions here, or perhaps reminders of the sorts of things you'd want to think about. Having some more numbers to work with would definitely help the analysis and help us do a more thorough analysis. And this is usually a point in the recommendations on the marking key. So suggesting revenue and profit analysis by individual client would be helpful to identify the most profitable client. So that would be a good one. We could suggest some changings around pricing, like increase the charge out rates or increase the use of performance-based pricing. And of course, you can tailor that to the specific scenario. Like we saw that large and major had seen an increase in the churn rate, but small and medium had gone down because more performance-based pricing was being used for small and medium clients. So we could see that there. And if you look at the client mix as well, if that's deviated away from the 25%, then suggest rebalancing it by targeting large and major. Remember, we're told in the AI that to rebalance it, they wouldn't not take on clients who are in the dominant categories. They wouldn't just decline small and medium clients. They would rebalance it by winning more of the clients in the declining streams. So in this case, targeting large and major clients. Introduce a performance-based bonus based on the average monthly fee income per head target, because that's the reason that revenue target wasn't achieved. They got the head count, but they didn't get the average income per head count. Then maybe slow recruitment to reduce the risk of overstaffing, because obviously headcount ended up higher than the target. Exit interviews, do more cross-selling. So there's quite a lot of recommendations you could come up with for requirement one, but try to focus on what's happened during the year. Like I said here, rebalancing the mix to large and major clients, because that's revenue mix has shifted towards small. Average monthly fee income per headcount didn't reach the target, so maybe have a bonus based on that. Obviously, recruitment was ahead of revenue, so maybe it's just slowing recruitment. So you can kind of see here how these points, these recommendations are kind of quite focused on and the most relevant to what's happened in the year. And you can kind of see how you'd pick some of these points up. You always get this one for any sensible recommendation, and these are the specific ones that you need to get. So you can see with the conclusions that the points were for a comment on total revenue with the figure, one on gross profit, all cost of sales, one on operating profit with the figure, and then on the advice request as well. So you can see how we would have picked up all of those conclusion points. Now, of course, we also need to do the executive summary. And by its very nature, a conclusion and a summary are quite similar. If you're going to conclude on a subject matter, or if you're going to summarize a subject matter, then they're quite a similar task. It'll be quite a similar exercise to do that. So inherently, the conclusions and the executive summary will look quite similar. If we're going to conclude on the performance for the year, well, we know that revenue's gone up by 32.8%, is slightly below the target. We know that these are all of the movements for each of the client sizes. We know that gross profit margin has increased because of that revenue mix shift. We know that operating profit margin's gone up, but it's still below the target. And we've been through the request for advice and given our opinion there. So if we conclude, on what we've been asked to, this is what, it's going to look like. These are the main points, and most of these points are factual. Now, if we're going to summarize the performance for the year, it's going to be very similar. Revenue's gone up by 32.8%. We've got each of the client sizes which have gone up or down, by the same amounts. These are factual amounts. So like a matter of fact, we've got here with the gross profit margin, it's gone up because of that revenue mix shift. If you're summarizing it, you're going to be pulling out like the main points that have happened in the year. If you're concluding on it, you'll be picking out the main points and the main findings. So therefore, the two are very similar, and therefore, they will look quite similar. And you can see that really in the marking key. If you look at the points here for the conclusions, comment on total revenue with the number, profit, both at gross level and operating profit, and the request for advice. So when you go to the marking for the exec summary, you can see here that these points, are the same as the conclusions. And you would expect that, because as I've just explained, if you're summarizing a subject matter and you're concluding on a subject matter, then inherently they are going to look quite similar. And of course, we've got the request for advice as well. So because a lot of this is kind of like a matter of fact, as I've explained, revenue's gone up by 32.8%. Gross profit margin's gone up because of the revenue mix shift. Operating profit is below the target. Because these are kind of like factual points, and you've already got these facts in the conclusions, because our conclusions are saying what the number's gone up by and a brief reason why. Then, as a starting point for your exec summary, you can copy your conclusions over. So that kind of gives us the base for our exec summary, because they're the simple facts of what's happened in the year. They're not going to change. If you rewrite those facts, there's so many different ways you can write that revenue's gone up by 32.8%. It's going to look more or less the same, whichever way you do it. So, to help you, use technology and to, save a bit of time, then I would suggest kind of copy and pasting your conclusions as a starting point. So you can kind of see that here with the unhighlighted text, which is what we have here, just so you've got the numbers, the basic numbers already in your exec summary, and that gives you, the base of your exec summary. And that's an acceptable, starting point to do that. The examiners have said, that's an acceptable thing to do just to begin your executive summary, because you've got the main facts there. But the exec summary is more than that. We need to do more than just having the basic facts on what has gone up or down in there. We need to kind of add some value here and add in some additional points. We're not just simply going to be saying what revenue has kind of gone up or down by for each of the client sizes, and what profit's gone up or down by for each of the client sizes. We do need to add in some additional points, and this is where the skill of the executive summary comes in, because of course this document can't be too long. It's like a quick high level summary for the directors, for a busy executive director to read. So it can't be too long. So therefore, it's not as though we can add in lots of additional points. There's a limit to how much we can add in. And that's reflected in the marking key, because you can see here that there's a point for appropriate summary of report. So you won't get this point if it gets too long. And there aren't that many marks available on the executive summary. So it's really important you get this. And this is a very easy mark. In fact, really, it's probably the easiest mark on the paper. It's quite rare that you actually kind of get a mark for doing, less, for doing nothing, because you're actually getting a mark here for not having too much. So as long as we keep it to a suitable length, we'll get this point. However, there will be some additional points in the exec summary, and what these are generally rewarding us for is for picking out these additional points that would be relevant to bring in to the exec summary. So when I say about adding in additional points, I don't mean that anything new that isn't already included in the main body of our report. What I mean is, remember that the conclusions just have the number and the brief reason. So for overall, just a number and a brief reason why. Major, number and a brief reason why. The same for all of it. Whereas in the main body of our report, we of course had number, reason, then we had some like further insight points, more detailed analysis on all of the different client sizes, with the gross profit as well. Yes, we've got the number and the brief reason why, that's what's in our conclusions. But then we had lots more analysis in the main body of our report. So the additional points we're bringing into the exec summary are points which weren't in the conclusions, but were in the main body of the report. So of course, we've got lots of points which weren't in the conclusions, but were in the main body of our report. So we can be selective and include about 3, 4, maximum 5 of those points and bring them in to the exec summary. And there will be marks on the marking key for bringing in some additional points that weren't in the conclusions, and also quite commonly for having specific recommendations as well. So in our exec summary section, we'll have the main part of the exec summary and then the recommendations. So in terms of bringing in some additional points into the exec summary, as I've said, we'll have our conclusions, and then we'll be able to bring in a few more additional points, but maybe look to include some additional points on significant changes in headcount or average monthly fee income per head, or if there's a particular client size which is seeing growth or possibly even a decline. Have there been any significant changes in profit margin, any significant changes in KPIs, maybe something to do with cash? Add in an extra point on the additional analysis issue as well. And we'd always have 2 points if we had ethics in there as well. So you start off with your conclusions and then you add in 3 additional points and just think about these. What's the most important things that have happened in the year? This will obviously vary between an exam and exam. So here, for example, in our conclusions, we had like the main point about overall revenue. But actually, there was a lot more interesting analysis that we had as well on overall revenue. Like we saw, yes, it didn't meet the target, but actually in our further analysis, we said that it didn't meet the target because average monthly fee income per head was below the target, but headcount actually was. So that would be useful to bring in an additional point there. So we've brought in that additional point there about average monthly fee income per head being below the target, and that's why the target overall wasn't met. So that was a useful point to bring in. We're thinking about points to bring to the attention of the directors, the ones which highlight the most significant events in the year. We're probably not going to add in an additional point on other expenses going up by 4.2%. It's a small expense category. It isn't a significant change. Why would we want to bring that to the attention of directors? Whereas here, when we're looking at overall revenue, a key number, overall revenue, and we're giving them more information, more analysis on why that target wasn't met. The target wasn't met. So that would be the main point there to add in on revenue. Other than that, I didn't really feel like there was anything that significant that had gone on in revenue. Could maybe have mentioned something a bit more about client churn perhaps, but these are all quite specific. A few new clients here and there. There wasn't really a huge amount that had happened that I felt necessary to bring to the attention of directors, particularly when I've got a few select points that I can bring in. But there was quite a big change on the profit margin. That's gone up quite impressively. And in our conclusions we had, because of the revenue mix shift between small and medium clients, but of course in our main body of our analysis, there was a lot more in there. That wasn't the only reason. The type of work and the type of billing as well had also moved to a more higher margin basis. So I've added those points in there as well, because this is a good thing. Profit margins are improving, and this is why. So again, that's something the directors, thinking about the overall strategy of the company, would be interested in. And what was quite interesting, that change in mix towards small clients, I've added a point in there. And then with the operating profit margin, yes, it's ended up below the target, but it has continued to increase. So I've added a point in there as well. And then, as I said, added in an additional point on the request for advice issue. So I had 2 points in the conclusions and just added in another point to the exec summary. So you see this highlighted text of the points which I've added in, which weren't in the conclusions. And then with your recommendations, I'd probably say 4, maximum of 5, because it needs to be a summary. So if you've got 7 or 8 in the main body, then having 4 or 5 in the exec summary, it would be fine, but you can't have all of your recommendations, otherwise it isn't a summary. But then just make sure you focus on the ones which are really important, and definitely have a couple on the request for advice. So survey staff, introduce a performance bonus based on the target would be a good one there. But definitely, in this business, staff management is a key issue. It's the key resource. It's what's been driving revenue. So I think we always need to think about staff in recommendations for all of the requirements and all issues facing the business. But surveying staff to identify how much space will be needed for the new office would be a good one, and then going ahead with the performance bonus as well. But then we've got our other recommendations as well, which weren't specific to the request for advice. So I've taken a couple of recommendations from here, and then I've taken 3 recommendations from here as well. But again, focusing on the ones which feel like most relevant to the specific scenario that's happened in the year, and the most pressing ones as well. So rebalance client mix, reduce the risk of overstaffing by slowing recruitment, and cross-sell more non-SEO work to improve margins. Because of course we saw that's what's helped margins go up in the year, which has been a really positive trend, a big, one of the key issues that's happened during the year, one of the key pieces of news from what's happened in the year. So getting these points on the exec summary is easy because you're getting them just from the conclusions and not letting it get too long. I mean, that was in the conclusions as well. So you can actually see the additional points here with specific recommendations rather than kind of adding these additional points here. But other times it could be a point for saying some further insight on the numbers or giving some more detail on what's caused revenue to change, or whether the target's been met or missed can sometimes be in there as well. It's really difficult to predict these points, and it is really quite difficult to get them. But you can kind of see that there's enough points there to score reasonably well there on the exec summary. So after attempting the mock exam, it's really important that you go away and mark your answer so that you can see where you scored marks and where you didn't score marks. And perhaps even more importantly, it will help familiarize you with the marking key. So you'll start to appreciate and understand, one, where points are awarded and in which box, and like the layout of the boxes. But 2 as well, you'll start to appreciate the type of points that get marks. And you can see that most of the points, the reasons, are coming from the exam paper information that we were given here in the scenario. So it's really important that you go away and mark your answer so you can see your strength areas and also pick out your weaknesses as well. But then also familiarize you with the marking key. And kind of like I said at the start of the question, when I read the requirement, I visualize what the marking key would look like. I've done so many of these exams now and mock exams, etc., etc. You know, this is just in my head. I know what these boxes will look like. I know the type of points that will be included in each box. And that's the position you want to get to, because it just gives you such a big advantage in the exam. You know, you're going into the exam where you need to score a certain number of marks to pass. And if you can estimate and predict, you know, what those points will be to score marks, of course, that's going to have a huge advantage to you in the exam. And the best way to familiarize yourself and develop your understanding of the marking key, of course, is to interact with it and use it actively. So after you've attempted your paper, you know, make sure you kind of go through and you mark and see where you did well, where you didn't do so well, and areas where you've dropped marks. You know, look at how I've structured it in my model answer and where I've included those points, and you know, the layout of the answer, which is of course, you know, following the pro forma report. But you can see how this is kind of structured in such a way to ensure that, you know, you will pick up enough marks across the requirement, and you will target, you know, all of these different boxes. Which of course, you know, it's adapted every time, you know, based on, you know, the exact requirement, what the examiner asks you to do, and the information the examiner gives you to answer that requirement. So it's kind of using this information as much as possible, like in this structure, to make sure that you hit as many different points as you can across these boxes. So really useful follow-up work after doing a mock exam is mark your answer, identify your strengths, identify your weaknesses, and then learn and understand how you should have got those extra points by looking at my model answer. And you can see as well how kind of short and concise all of my points are. And this helps ensure that I do it within the time, whilst also having sufficient depth to pick up all of the points that the examiners are looking for.